What if Robert Rogers had won key battles against the French? A different colonial America. History is often shaped not by grand inevitabilities, but by pivotal moments and individuals whose actions echo across time. One such figure is Robert Rogers, the famed leader of Rogers Rangers, a feared and innovative colonial militia during the French and Indian War. But what if his victories had been even more decisive? What if Rogers had won key battles that turned the tides of history? The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, was a monumental clash between two global powers, Britain and France, fighting for dominance in North America. Between 1754 and 1763, both sides vied for control of immense territories stretching from the Mississippi River to the Appalachian Mountains. At the heart of the conflict, indigenous nations formed key alliances with both sides, adding complexity and stakes to the war. For Britain, triumph in this war was essential to establish itself as the premier colonial power in the Americas. But victory was far from guaranteed. The French controlled critical forts and waterways, and their alliances with native tribes gave them strategic advantages. This was the chaotic battlefield on which Robert Rogers emerged. A product of the frontier, he forged new paths in guerrilla warfare and led daring missions, disrupting the French and their allies at every turn. But as history went, even Rogers faced limitations. Yet in this alternate scenario, we wonder, what if those limitations fell away? What if Rogers had not only succeeded, but succeeded decisively? Before we dive into the alternate reality, it's critical to understand the man at the center of this story. Born in 1731 in Massachusetts, Robert Rogers grew up in the rugged wilderness of New Hampshire, where survival depended on knowledge of the terrain and adaptability. These early experiences carved him into a leader uniquely suited for frontier warfare. Rogers Rangers, a unit he founded during the French and Indian War, became synonymous with unconventional combat. Famed for their speed, surprise, and brutal efficiency, his troops pioneered tactics still studied in military history. Rogers outlined his strategies in his Rules of Ranging, a handbook for irregular warfare that remains influential to this day. His most famous exploits included scouting missions deep behind enemy lines, raids on French settlements, and fierce battles against French and indigenous forces. Yet despite his legendary status, Rogers faced setbacks. His efforts were often undercut by a lack of resources, poor coordination with British regulars, and the sheer difficulty of the terrain. But what if the outcomes of his campaigns had been different? Let's reimagine history. In our alternate timeline, Robert Rogers achieves sweeping victories in key battles of the French and Indian War. He swiftly neutralizes critical French forts like Fort Carillon, modern-day Fort Ticonderoga, undermines French supply lines, and decisively defeats indigenous allies aligned with the French. These victories aren't just tactical. They crush French morale and momentum, forcing an earlier withdrawal from contested territories. With Rogers carving a path to glory, the British tightened their grasp on North America faster than in our reality. The French, facing mounting losses and diminishing support from indigenous allies, surrender control of strategic regions well before the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The British find themselves the unchallenged colonial power in the region. But how does this change America? Let's explore the implications. In this alternate scenario, the first and most obvious change is territorial. With the French decisively beaten earlier in the war, key areas such as the Ohio River Valley, Great Lakes region, and much of modern-day Canada fall under British control far sooner. The dream of French North America begins to evaporate much earlier than it did historically. Quebec, the stronghold of French culture and governance in the Americas, likely sees a swifter erosion of its identity as Anglophone settlers flood into newly acquired territories. Britain's expanded control accelerates westward colonial expansion. Colonists, emboldened by military successes led by figures like Rogers, begin eyeing lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. But this expansion brings consequences, not just for the colonists but also for native nations whose alliances and territorial claims are thrown into chaos. In reality, Native American tribes played a pivotal role during the French and Indian War by aligning with either the French or the British based on shared interests. Many sided with the French, who posed less of a direct colonial threat compared to the land-hungry British settlers. However, in our scenario, Rogers' devastating victories diminished the French presence earlier, forcing native tribes to renegotiate their allegiances with the dominant British. This shift could lead to more tension, as the British, now unopposed, are less inclined to honor territorial agreements. Rogers' hypothetical successes may inadvertently accelerate the displacement and marginalization of native peoples, sparking earlier and more widespread conflicts like those seen later in Pontiac's rebellion. With French threats eliminated earlier, the colonies experience a period of unprecedented security. But this security comes at a cost. London's victory prompts a heavier presence of British soldiers and administrators in the colonies, along with stricter enforcement of taxes and trade regulations to fund their expanded empire. Historically, the post-war period sowed seeds of discontent among the colonists, culminating in the American Revolution. Would Rogers' victories fast-track this rebellion? Or could British dominance delay the colonies' push for independence, as tensions over defense and borders are resolved more quickly? One plausible outcome is a more centralized colonial administration under British rule, which might stifle revolutionary sentiment temporarily. On the other hand, the earlier removal of the French threat could make colonists feel more emboldened to challenge British authority. The results hinge on complex social and political dynamics. In this alternate timeline, Robert Rogers isn't just another name in North America's early military history. He becomes a pivotal figure in shaping colonial identity. A string of decisive victories would elevate him to the ranks of mythic heroes, perhaps even rivaling George Washington in prominence. But could Rogers' fame extend beyond military success? If he were instrumental in spearheading the consolidation of British colonial power, he might emerge as a statesman or leader in helping shape policy for British America. Alternatively, his guerrilla tactics and frontier ethos could inspire early revolutionary leaders who adopt his strategies for their own cause. An earlier British consolidation in North America has cultural consequences as well. French influence is diminished, leading to possible earlier Anglicization of regions like Quebec and Louisiana. How would American culture look today if French language and customs faded earlier in history? Economically, British control of French territories allows earlier access to critical resources like furs and timber. This could fuel colonial wealth and expansion, but might also exacerbate inequalities and tensions between the colonies and the mother country. The Hudson Bay Company and other trading entities could expand their monopolies, shaping an economy that is even more deeply entrenched in British market control. The effects of Rogers' victories aren't confined to North America. Globally, a more decisive British win in the 7 Years' War shifts the balance of power in Europe as well. France might seek different avenues for colonial expansion, turning its attention to other territories in Africa or Asia to compensate for its losses. Meanwhile, an empowered British Empire might face fewer early challenges in the Americas, redirecting resources to other imperial pursuits. Could this lead to a different British posture in India or the Caribbean? The ripple effects are endless. One of the most fascinating questions this scenario raises is whether the American Revolution occurs at all or in the same form. Without the territorial disputes that fueled early tensions between Britain and its colonies, it's possible that colonial unity develops in a different way. Robert Rogers himself, a loyal British soldier, might even find himself on the wrong side of history if rebellion occurs. Alternatively, British overreach in enforcing taxes and territorial control could spark an even earlier revolution. Such a conflict might be colored more by frontier skirmishes, with Rogers' guerrilla tactics employed against Britain instead of France. In this timeline, Rogers might serve as a bridge between loyalty to the crown and the emerging spirit of independence, becoming a more complicated historical figure. History is a fragile tapestry, woven from the decisions of individuals and the outcomes of singular events. Robert Rogers, with his brilliance in frontier warfare, played his part in shaping colonial America. But the outcomes were limited by circumstances he couldn't control. In our hypothetical timeline, these limitations vanish, allowing us to imagine an alternate colonial America and beyond. Would Rogers' victories ultimately lead to a more unified British America or hasten its fragmentation? Would native nations find a stronger voice or face earlier tragedies? And how would the world's great empires reshuffle their priorities in response to an altered balance of power? In this exploration, we've traveled alongside Robert Rogers through the dense forests and snowy battlefields of an alternate past. By giving him greater triumphs, we've opened the door to a cascade of possibilities, some inspiring, others daunting. Such what-if scenarios remind us that history isn't preordained. It's a series of chances, shaped by people and the decisions they make. As we conclude, we invite you to imagine, what if Rogers' victories had rewritten history? How might the world you live in today be different? Share your thoughts, engage in the conversation, and keep exploring the boundless landscapes of alternate history. History buffs, the journey never ends. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.